Welcome everybody to Greek civilization. We're going to cover a bunch of different topics this week. The first topic we're going to cover is why study Greek history at all. We're going to see how that ties into the study of human nature, whether things are different or the same in the ancient world. Then we're going to look at some of the discoveries, refinements, and origins that influenced our modern times from the ancient world. Then we're going to take a step back and look at the geography and physical attributes in the land and the climate of ancient Greece. What are the basic facts about the ancient world? What was Greece? Who are the people that lived there? Finally, we're going to look at chronology and dating. How do we know what we know? What types of evidences do we use to categorize the knowledge that we have about the ancient world? And which contexts are applicable to which different type of evidence? We're going to look at literary, archaeological, numismatics, papyrology, and all those different types of scenarios. One of the main questions that anybody studies when they study ancient Greece is the ancient world the same or different? So obviously it's got a bunch of the same characteristics and social phenomena going on in the ancient world. This is not a surprise. We have love, we have marriage, we have death, we have war, we have taxes, we have families, we have going to school, getting drunk, you name it. And so when we think about studying the ancient world, we have to ask ourselves, are we mainly interested in the things that are the same, or are we mainly interested in the things that are different? That's one of the first questions that you need to ask yourself when you're studying the ancient world. I personally mainly tend towards thinking that we're the same as the ancient Greeks. So when we study things like the family, when we study things like society and economics and religion, we can actually understand certain things about ourselves. We also have to be alive to the differences, of course. One main strand that connects the ancient Greeks to us is our tradition of literature. Now, Homer is the first poet of Greece, and he's also the first extant work of the Western literary tradition in general because of the connection of Greece to our own civilization. Just in thinking about Homer, we can start to access the question of how is Homer just like the literature that we read today? How did it influence the literature that we read today? And how is it different from the literature that we read today? We'll see that the composition context of Homer is much, much different than, say, Tolstoy's War and Peace or Shakespeare or a modern novel today. An important question to ask is whether we can learn anything from this study. Can we learn anything from the study of the ancient world? And the way that I want to start to answer this question here is to think about the concept of a society or a city. The ancient Greek word for city was a polis. A polis or city-state was an independent entity that ruled itself and was not subject to any larger state. In other words, it was a city, but at the same time it was its own state. The polis included the city itself and its surrounding territory, and its citizens held a kind of citizenship. They held this citizenship in their polis and nowhere else. In other words, they were Greeks, they spoke the same language, they went to the same religious festivals, but they also only were citizens in their own city. And this push and pull between a Pan-Hellenic identity and a polis-first identity is fundamental to ancient Greece. Now keep in mind, however, that the Greeks didn't invent the city. They didn't invent citizenship. For example, ancient civilizations such as the Sumerians in southern Iraq and Mesopotamia had already had societies and cities like this almost 3,000 years before this. But Greek city-states were, in an important way, unique. They were unique for their many different constitutions and the degree to which they debated amongst themselves what the best form of state formation and civilization actually was. In fact, the Greeks even called a man who stayed at home and didn't go out to participate in civic activities an idiot. This is where the word idiot comes from. To the Greeks, being free meant being free to take part in the decisions of the city. It meant being free to take part in all the civic decisions and community events like religious festivals and wars. Aristotle said man was fundamentally a political beast, a beast of the city. Politics and social organization was not the only way that the Greeks expressed themselves. They have given us refinements and improvements, although sometimes they might not be improvements, in many different areas of society. So for example, we have math. A figure such as Pythagoras, who is an ancient, almost mythical figure, and his famous theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This is obviously something that's fundamental to mathematics today. It's unclear whether Pythagoras it's a little bit strange to say that he invented this theorem or he discovered this theorem. This is how it's come down to us today, basically in myth. And you compare him to a figure like Euclid, who is a historical man. He's not a mythical figure like Pythagoras. He simply wrote a book called The Elements of Geometry, which is one of the most influential and popular books of all time in the Western world in mathematics. It was the basis for how to learn geometry, spatial geometry, for 2,000 years. Another realm where the Greeks gave us refinements and improvements and knowledge was, of course, art, sculpture, and architecture. Even in realms like painting, where we don't have a lot of paintings that have come down to us, because Greek religious architecture was such a fundamental part of their culture, much of their art was infused into our civic spaces. So, of course, Greek architectural influence is everywhere in the world. We have neoclassical, Greek revival, you name it. And America displays its homage to the Greek legacy on its most important buildings in Washington, D.C. and everywhere. Another somewhat obvious point about ancient Greece being a model for modern times is in athletic competition and the modern Olympic Games. The spirit of competition was central to Greek warfare and religion. And so it was also central to athletic competition when they came together to celebrate and to compete against each other. For example, Homer in his Iliad sums this up when his characters say that they, quote, strive to always be the best and surpass all others. This is one part of the Homeric code which infused all of Greek mentality. Athletic festivals were religious events first and foremost. They were dedicated to one or more gods, and they had an element of merrymaking and release, but also they were strict religious events. We've kind of lost this religious aspect in our celebration of the modern Olympic Games, but we've replaced their religion with a kind of nationalism ourselves, which has a bit of the same emotion. In antiquity, every 4 years the Olympics were performed, and there were other Olympic festivals, the Pythian Games, the Nemean Games, and the Isthmian Games. When these events took place, all of the different polis, or cities in Greece, even if they were at war, even if they hated each other, they all entered a truce together so they could compete and travel together and watch the events take place as spectators. So it was a break from their internecine struggles to come together in these athletic competitions. And athletic competition thus combined the Greek attention to physical prowess with the reverence for the gods. It's one of the most signal characteristics of Greek culture is this very agonistic, competitive nature, but also combining this with a religious attitude. The games were a central cultural activity for all ancient Greece. So ancient Greece was defined by its geography and demography. Because of the compartmentalization brought on by geography, Greece was defined by its smaller interrelated regions. There were 4 or 5 major ethnic divisions among the Greeks, each with their own dialect of the Greek language, and a few customs they shared, but which other regions of Greece didn't have. Now, the Greeks were very loyal to their own city-state, or polis, and there never quite was the nationalistic or pan-Hellenic spirit to the extent that we have had in America or in other modern countries in the West, obviously. So, while the Greeks to some degree certainly shared a sense of pan-Hellenism or Greekness or nationality, that is, having common descent, speaking a common language and customs, the Greeks were first and foremost loyal to their own city or polis. And these two facts, the facts that they were loyal to their city, but also believed themselves to be Greeks, is one of the causes of the dynamism that's so inherent in Greek culture. In fact, throughout all of history, there were really only 3 periods of widespread unity among the Greeks that stand out in the course of Greek history. These would have been periods where the Greeks overcame ethnic divisions and cultural differences to unite as one. We have first, the Trojan War, which is around 1200 BCE, 2, the Persian invasion from 480 to 78 BCE, and 3, Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire from around 334 to 323 BCE. Of course, recall that the first of these was actually a legend rather than truly historical. So if you're only counting historical, there were only 2 points in ancient Greece when they all came together, banded together, and acted as one. Otherwise, Greek history is a story of conflicts between polis and small regional alliances forming and breaking up. Now, Greece was not isolated from the wider world. Greek contact with the Near East, that is Syria, Phoenicia, which is modern Lebanon, and Palestine, brought many cultural influences that were fundamental to the development of ancient Greece. Examples include the Hittite and Babylonian creation myths, which influenced Greek myth and Hesiod, to the Phoenician alphabet, and to numerous loanwords which were embedded in that alphabet, to the artistic styles in the Orientalizing period. So the Greeks extended their presence across the entire Mediterranean in various periods through trade. By sending out colonies, they would influence these other cultures and be influenced in turn. The reasons varied for these interactions, as we shall see later, but Greek colonies popped up everywhere, from Spain and South France, an example is Marseille, to Cyprus, and from the north shore of the Black Sea, which is modern Ukraine, to North Africa and in the south. Evidence of the Greek presence has even been found as far afield as Bahrain. So this is Greece proper. The area is dominated by the Pindus mountain range and the Cycladic Islands. There are about 5,000 islands total in Greece, 200 of which were inhabited. Average annual rainfall varies from 50 to 121 centimeters, that's 20 to 48 inches in the north, and from 38 to 81 centimeters, that's 15 to 32 in the south. Although the Greeks were divided by geography and sometimes by dialect groups, they were said by the philosopher Plato to be like frogs around a pond. That is, their life was tied to the sea. The result of this was that from very early on, the Greeks traded around the Mediterranean. This was the cause of their interactions with the Phoenicians and the peoples to the west. They established contacts with colonies. Now, the sea surrounding Greece, and in Greece there were no navigable rivers, there was little tidal movement. There were very strong regional and local winds, which, when the Greeks understood them, were used for navigation. There was high salinity in the sea. It wasn't the context that was easiest to navigate. This determined how the Greeks interacted with their neighbors. Anyway, Greece is about the size of Alabama, and it's about 75% mountains. Only 30% of the land is suitable for agriculture, and not all of that is good quality arable land. Because of the way the mountains run northwest to southeast down the Balkan Peninsula, Greece only has a few large plains, and they're here in the north, in Thessaly. In central and southern Greece, mountains divide the land into narrow valleys and leave only small coastal plains near the sea. Greece, as it still does, typifies the Mediterranean climate. This climate supports a three-staple food system in the Greek diet. We have grain or barley, olives, and grapes, which was used for wine. There were, of course, other common foods like veggies, cheese, figs, garlic, onions, but these three were said to be their cash crops, so to speak. And this was at least since 3000 BCE. In fact, olive oil, which was used for cooking, for soap, and for lamps, was so important that it was traded abroad to obtain grains and other things. In other words, it was a cash crop. Meat and also fish were actually eaten only rarely. It was expensive to capture and to conserve meat and fish. Now, cattle and horses, although needed for plowing any significant plot of land, were also expensive to maintain, and they needed lots of grazing land to be kept. And of course, as we noticed, Greece didn't have a lot of grazing land. Because of this, cattle, and especially horses, became symbols, status symbols for the rich throughout Greek history. Regardless, we still must remember as we go through this course that even at the height of the classical Greek culture through the 5th to the 3rd centuries, when, for us, Greek was this rich, powerful, populous country, Greece was still largely a land of small-scale farmers. Each holding probably had about 8 to 10 men that would, on average, be working in. So, how do we know what we know about the ancient world? There are two broad types of evidence from the ancient world that we use today, and that's archaeology and literary texts. So technically, everything before the appearance of writing is considered to be prehistory and can only be accessed through archaeology. We rely on the evidence of archaeology to give us insight and to shed a light into how these people lived. Now, most of the evidence for ancient Greece, archaeologically speaking, is buried underground. It's not sitting on the surface. We also have underwater archaeology, which is a new great source of info which looks into shipwrecks. And in these shipwrecks, we can see that wood and cloth and leather are actually found a little more often than in archaeological digs. Obviously, fired clay, which was used to make pots, is fundamental to the study of archaeology because it's most easily saved, so we have a lot of that. It lasts virtually forever, and thus it's useful for dating. Now, literary texts generally come down to us in two different ways. One is through the papyrus, which is found in the sands of Egypt. Now, papyrus is a plant, and the only way that we have access to papyrus is in towns that actually were Roman towns built up in the Roman period and then were abandoned, so they basically were just left in the desert and mummified alligators. Now, manuscripts are something else entirely. They gradually, throughout the late antiquity and the Middle Ages, became much more common than papyrus. They're made usually from dried animal skins. It's very similar to thick leather. Now, when a historian takes a look at this evidence, in other words, the archaeological evidence on the one hand and the literary evidence on the other hand, he tries to piece them together to create an explicable account of what happened in the ancient world so we can associate it with our own lives. It's important to note here that each type of information has different strengths and weaknesses. On the literary side, you might say that both the strength and the weakness of a literary account is that it's tied very tightly to a specific point of view, often a very affluent, upper class point of view, because those are the people that had access to education, those are the people that had access to writing. So their accounts are always much fuller than simply a stone in the ground, but they also are tied very, very tightly to their specific perspective. So you have something that's perhaps, that's always the trade-off that you need to make. When you're looking at archaeological accounts, they're much more muted. They don't say as much. The books of St. Augustine tell you much, much more about Christianity than the remains of a church could ever tell you. But the books of St. Augustine are, of course, tied completely to his individual perspective. So he's missing out on all of the things that he doesn't understand. And that is the same for every type of literary account. So when we look and try to access or create our own historical accounts in ancient Greece, we need to take this into account. We need to use both the archaeological evidence and the literary evidence and meld them together in order to create an explicable, pleasing, accurate account of the ancient world that inspires us to make connections to our own lives. So basically, all accounts of historians need to be taken with a grain of salt. Since even if an ancient historian or someone who is creating a literary account did want to tell the truth of what happened, like St. Augustine, he also would do so selectively and with an artistic flourish. A couple brief things about dating and terms. BCE and CE. BCE means before the Common Era, also known as BC. CE means the Common Era, which is also known as AD. A quick note on periodization. Now, periodization is the delineation and the definition of the different periods within which ancient Greece is considered to exist. The entire scope of the Stone Age or the Lithic period is from around 40,000 to 3000 BCE. The Bronze Age is from around 3000 to 1000 BCE. The Greek Dark Ages was from around 1000 to 750 BCE. An example of something that happened here was the first Olympic Games were celebrated in 776 BCE. Now the Archaic period, which basically dates from the beginning of writing, as we mentioned earlier, from 750 to 500 BCE. And in this period we have polis formation, the rise of the Greek tyrants, the Orientalizing period, the rise of the monumental architecture and sculpture. It's a very important period. Then we have the Classical period of ancient Greece from 500 to 323 BCE. This is the golden age of Athenian democracy. We have advances in the arts, sciences, philosophy, then the Persian Wars, creation of the Delian League, the Athenian Empire, finally the Peloponnesian War told by Thucydides, and then the fall of Athens and Sparta to the Macedonians, the conquest of Alexander, and the death of Alexander the Great, 323 BCE. The death of Alexander the Great ushers in the Hellenistic period, which is generally from 323 BCE to the Battle of Actium. And then we have the Roman period, which is basically the Battle of Actium until the fall of the Roman Empire, whenever that is. We'll worry about that later. All right, thanks a lot, guys, and I'll see you next time.